In the cursed Badlands of Wyoming Territory, 1876, a Lakota warrior named Mop found a young Irish girl hanging from a twisted oak with a crude wooden sign nailed above her head. "Savages don't belong." What he discovered that blood-red October night would shatter everything he believed about the white man's justice and ignite a love story so forbidden it would make both their peoples hunt them to the ends of the earth. This is the story of how a man who had lost everything learned that sometimes salvation comes disguised as the enemy, and how a girl marked for death became the reason he remembered how to live.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
The Wyoming Territory stretched endless and unforgiving. Under the dying light of autumn 1876, its rolling hills painted in shades of copper and gold that would soon surrender to winter's harsh grip. The air carried the scent of sagebrush and the distant promise of snow, while overhead, a blood moon hung like a crimson eye watching the earth below. It was the kind of night when the old Lakota stories whispered that spirits walked between worlds, and the line between the living and the dead grew thin as morning mist. Mop rode his painted Mustang through the broken country south of Deadwood, moving with the silent precision that had kept him alive through 3 brutal years of war against the white soldiers. His long black hair, streaked now with premature silver at 28, flowed loose beneath a weathered cavalry hat he had taken from a dead bluecoat at Little Bighorn. The irony was not lost on him that he wore the enemy's headgear while hunting. The same deer that had once grazed peacefully in valleys now soaked with blood. His rifle, a Winchester he had liberated from a settler's abandoned cabin, rested across his lap with the casual familiarity of a man who had learned to sleep with death as his only companion. The weapon was well maintained, its brass fittings polished to a dull gleam, but Mop's eyes held the hollow distance of someone who had killed too often and saved too few. He was a ghost riding through a world that no longer recognized him, belonging neither to the reservation where his people slowly starved, nor to the white settlements that shot Indians on sight. The Mustang's hooves made soft percussion against the hard-packed earth as they navigated the narrow game trail that wound between stands of aspen and pine. Mop had been tracking a wounded elk for the better part of 2 days, following a blood trail that had led him far from the relative safety of the Black Hills, into territory claimed by both the U.S. Army and various outlaw gangs who preyed on anyone foolish enough to travel alone. But hunger made men brave, and Mop's band of 14 survivors needed meat more than they needed safety. It was the sound that stopped him first. So faint it might have been wind through dead leaves, but Mop's ears had been trained by warfare to distinguish between the natural whispers of the wilderness and something else entirely. He raised his hand, and his Mustang froze mid-step, both rider and horse becoming statues in the gathering darkness. The sound came again, barely audible above the soft sigh of wind through the canyon walls. A whimper, weak and desperate, like an animal caught in a trap. Mop's grip tightened on his rifle as he scanned the landscape ahead. The game trail led into a narrow draw bordered by weathered sandstone cliffs, the kind of place where ambushes were born and travelers died. But something about the sound pulled at him, reminded him of his sister Winona's voice during the massacre at Wounded Knee when she had called for help that never came. He had learned to ignore such memories, to bury them deep beneath the practical necessities of survival. But tonight the blood moon seemed to resurrect every ghost he had tried to forget. He dismounted silently, ground-tying his Mustang with a practiced motion, and moved forward on foot. The Winchester felt heavy in his hands as he worked his way through the scattered boulders and scrub oak that choked the narrow canyon. Every shadow could hide an enemy, every rock formation could conceal a rifle barrel, but the whimpering continued, growing slightly stronger as he advanced. It was definitely human now, and definitely female, and definitely in distress. The clearing opened before him like a theater stage set for tragedy. A massive cottonwood tree dominated the space, its ancient trunk scarred by lightning and carved with the initials of long-dead lovers. But it was what hung from the tree's lowest branch that made Mop's blood turn to ice water in his veins. A young woman, barely more than a girl, hung suspended by her wrists from a rope that had been thrown over the branch and secured to the trunk. Her feet dangled inches from the ground, and her body swayed gently in the evening breeze like some macabre pendulum marking time toward death. Above her head, nailed to the tree with railroad spikes that had been driven deep into the bark, hung a crude wooden board. The words painted across its surface in what looked like dried blood made Mop's jaw clench with a fury he had not felt since watching his village burn. Savages don't belong. The letters were uneven, painted by an angry hand that had pressed the brush hard enough to leave gouges in the wood, and below the main message, in smaller script, someone had added, "This is what happens to Indian lovers." The girl herself was clearly not Indian, a fact that made the sign's message even more chilling in its implications. Her skin was pale as moonlight where it showed through the tears in her dress, and her hair, matted now with blood and dirt, caught the crimson light of the moon and revealed itself to be a deep auburn that would probably shine like copper in sunlight. She wore the remains of what had once been a decent traveling dress, dark blue wool, now stained and torn, suggesting she was no common saloon girl or camp follower, but someone of at least modest means. Her face, though swollen and bruised, held a delicate beauty that spoke of gentle upbringing rather than frontier hardship. High cheekbones framed eyes that fluttered occasionally in semi-consciousness, and her lips, cracked and bleeding from thirst, moved soundlessly as if she were trying to pray or call for help that her voice was too weak to summon. She could not have been more than 19 or 20, Mop judged, young enough to still believe the world held more good than evil. The rope that bound her wrists was rough hemp, the kind used for heavy lifting around mining camps and cattle ranches, and it had been tied with the professional efficiency of someone who knew how to secure a load. Her wrists were raw and bleeding where the rope had cut into flesh, and Mop could see that whoever had done this had intended for her to suffer before she died. This was not a quick execution born of frontier justice, but something slower, more deliberate, designed to send a message that would echo long after her body was found. Mop stood frozen in the shadows at the edge of the clearing, his rifle trained on the tree line as he searched for any sign of the men who had done this. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to turn around and ride away. He had enough troubles without adding a white woman to his problems, especially one whose rescue would undoubtedly be seen as an act of war by every settlement between here and Denver. The sign made it clear that she had been condemned for associating with Indians, which meant helping her would only confirm the worst assumptions about his people and paint a target on his back that would follow him across the continent. But as he watched her struggle weakly against her bonds, as he saw the way her body trembled with cold and exhaustion, memories flooded back with the unstoppable force of a spring avalanche. He remembered his sister Winona, barely 16 when the soldiers came to their winter camp. He remembered finding her body 3 days later, scalped and violated, left for the coyotes to finish what men had started. He remembered his mother, standing there, woman who had died clutching the wooden cross the missionary had given her, still believing that the white man's God would protect her even as their bullets tore her apart. The girl's whimper brought him back to the present, and he realized that his hands were shaking with something that was not quite rage and not quite grief, but a mixture of both that threatened to overwhelm his carefully maintained control. 3 years of war had taught him that mercy was a luxury he could not afford. That sentiment was a weakness that got good people killed. But looking at this broken child hanging from a tree like strange fruit, he felt something crack inside his chest. Some wall he had built around his heart beginning to crumble. He thought of his grandfather, Spotted Eagle, who had taught him that
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
A warrior's true strength was not measured by the enemies he killed, but by the innocents he saved. The spirits judge us not by the hatred we carry, the old man had said, but by the compassion we show when showing it costs us everything. It was the kind of wisdom that sounded beautiful around a council fire, but felt like a death sentence. In the middle of hostile territory, with winter coming and 14 mouths to feed. Ma Pe spent another 5 minutes, scanning the area for any sign of watchers or guards, before he was satisfied that whoever had done this had left their victim to die alone. The moon had risen higher now, its red light casting everything in shades of blood and shadow, making the whole scene feel like something from a fever dream. He moved forward slowly, keeping to the shadows until he was close enough to see the rise and fall of the girl's chest, confirming that she was still alive despite her ordeal. "Can you hear me?" he whispered in English, his voice barely audible above the night wind. The girl's eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then widening with fear as she saw the dark figure approaching her. She tried to speak, but only a hoarse croak emerged from her damaged throat. Map raised his hand slowly, showing that he meant no harm, though he kept his rifle within easy reach in case this proved to be some elaborate trap. "I'm going to cut you down," he said, still speaking in the careful English he had learned. From the missionary schools before the war made such education a liability. "Try not to move. The rope is cut deep, and I don't want to hurt you worse." The girl's eyes tracked his movements as he approached the tree, and he could see intelligence there beneath the pain and fear. She was aware enough to understand his words, which was a good sign, though her pale complexion and the blue tinge around her lips suggested that hypothermia was setting in. Map pulled his hunting knife from its sheath, a blade he had forged himself from a piece of railroad steel, its edge honed to razor sharpness. The rope was thick and had tightened under the girl's weight, making it difficult to work the blade underneath without cutting her wrists further. He had to stretch up on his toes to reach the knots, and for a moment he was vulnerable, his attention focused entirely on the delicate work of freeing her without causing more damage. The rope parted with a sound like a gunshot in the stillness, and the girl's full weight dropped into Mop's arms. She was lighter than he had expected, probably weakened by days without food or water, and he staggered slightly before regaining his balance. Her head lolled against his shoulder, and he could feel the fever heat radiating from her skin through the torn fabric of her dress. She was in bad shape, worse than he had initially thought, and he realized that cutting her down had been only the first step in what would likely be a long and dangerous journey toward recovery. Ma Pe carried the girl to a relatively sheltered spot beneath an overhang of rock, where the moonlight was blocked but the wind could not reach them. He laid her down gently on his own bedroll, which he spread over the sandy ground, and began to assess her injuries by touch, since the darkness made visual examination nearly impossible. Her wrists were the worst problem, cut deep enough that he could feel the sticky warmth of fresh blood, and he knew that infection would set in quickly if the wounds were not properly cleaned and dressed. From his saddlebags, he retrieved a small leather pouch containing the basic medical supplies that any warrior carried on long journeys: dried willow bark for pain, sage for cleansing wounds, and clean strips of cloth that could serve as bandages. He also carried a small clay bottle of whiskey, not for drinking, but for cleaning wounds and sterilizing instruments. It was a meager collection compared to what a real doctor might carry, but it had kept him alive through dozens of minor injuries, and a few major ones. "This is going to hurt," he warned her as he prepared to clean the rope burns on her wrists. The girl's eyes had closed again, but he could tell from her breathing that she was conscious, just conserving what little strength she had left. He poured a small amount of whiskey over the wounds, and she jerked involuntarily, a soft cry escaping her lips. But she did not pull away or try to fight him, which suggested either remarkable self-control or simply a lack of strength to resist. As he worked, wrapping her wrists in clean cloth with the practiced efficiency of someone who had tended many battlefield wounds, Map found himself studying her face in the dim light. She was beautiful, there was no denying that, but it was not the painted beauty of the saloon girls in Deadwood or the carefully arranged prettiness of the officers' wives he had seen from a distance. This was something more natural, more honest. The kind of beauty that came from good breeding and a life lived mostly outdoors. Her hands, though soft, showed calluses that suggested she was no stranger to work, and her nails were short and practical rather than decorative. "What's your name?" he asked as he finished with the bandages, speaking quietly to avoid startling her. The girl's eyes opened again, and this time they seemed more focused, more aware of her surroundings. She tried to speak, but her voice was still too weak to be understood. Map reached for his water canteen and carefully drizzled a small amount between her lips, watching as she swallowed eagerly despite the pain it must have caused her damaged throat. "Sarah," she finally managed to whisper, the word barely audible but clear enough for him to understand. Sarah McCready. The name was Irish, which explained her coloring and perhaps something about how she had ended up in this situation. The Irish were not well loved by many Americans, almost as despised as the Indians in some quarters, and an Irish girl who consorted with savages would be seen as doubly damned by the kind of men who painted signs in blood. Over the next hour, as Mop tended to her other injuries and tried to get some warm broth into her system, Sarah's story began to emerge in fragments. She spoke slowly, her voice gaining strength as the whiskey numbed her pain and the warm liquid restored some vitality to her battered body. Each word seemed to cost her effort, but she was determined to make him understand what had happened and why she had been left to die in such a horrible way. Sarah McCready had come to Wyoming Territory 6 months earlier with her father, Patrick McCready, an Irish immigrant who had scraped together enough money to buy a small ranch in the foothills east of the Bighorn Mountains. Patrick had been a dreamer, the kind of man who believed that America truly was a land where hard work and honest dealing could overcome the prejudices of birth and accent. He had treated everyone fairly, including the small band of Lakota who occasionally camped on his land during their seasonal migrations. "Papa said they were just people," Sarah whispered, tears cutting tracks through the dirt on her cheeks. "Said they had as much right to the water and grass as anyone. Most of the other ranchers, they wanted to run them off, but Papa ... Papa said there was enough land for everyone if folks would just stop being greedy about it." It was a naive philosophy in a territory where greed and violence were the primary currencies, but Mop found himself respecting the dead man's idealism, even as he mourned its predictable consequences. The trouble had started when Sarah began helping a young Lakota woman named Blue Dawn, who was pregnant and had been beaten by her white trader husband when he discovered the child might not be his. Sarah had hidden the woman in their root cellar and helped deliver the baby when Blue Dawn went into premature labor. The child had lived only a few hours, but in those hours, Sarah had done everything she could to ease both mother and baby's suffering, showing a kindness that transcended the racial hatreds that poisoned the territory. Word of Sarah's actions had spread quickly through the network of ranchers and townspeople who saw any kindness toward Indians as treason against white civilization. A group of vigilantes, led by a rancher named Jeremiah Colt, who had lost his own son in an Indian raid the previous year, had decided to make an example of the McCready family. They had come at night, burned the ranch house, killed Patrick McCready, and taken Sarah to be hanged as a warning to anyone else who might consider showing mercy to savages. "They said I was a betrayer of my own kind," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger with anger now. "Said I had Indian blood on my hands and deserved to die like one. But Papa always said that blood is just blood, and it's what you do with your heart that makes you human or monster. The words hit Mop like physical blows, because they echoed so closely his own grandfather's teachings about the nature of humanity and the arbitrary divisions that men created to justify their cruelties. As Sarah's story unfolded, Mop felt something shifting inside him, a recognition that went deeper than sympathy or even compassion. Here was someone who had suffered for the same ideals that had driven his own family to destruction. Someone who had been marked for death because she refused to see his people as less than human. The irony was not lost on him that a white woman had shown more courage in defending Indians than many Indians had shown in defending themselves. "My name is Mape," he said finally, setting aside the facade of distance he usually maintained with whites. "It means sky in my language. My people called me that because I was born during a thunderstorm, and my grandmother said I would bring either great fortune or great trouble to those around me." He paused, studying Sarah's face in the dim light. "So far it has been mostly trouble." Sarah managed a weak smile at that, the first sign of humor she had shown since he found her. "Well, Mr. Sky," she said, her voice still hoarse but gaining character, "I'd say finding me hanging from a tree probably counts as trouble, so at least you're living up to your reputation." The fact that she could joke, even weakly, in her condition, spoke to a strength of spirit that impressed Mop more than any physical courage could have. He told her briefly about his own losses, about Wounded Knee and the destruction of his band, about the 3 years he had spent moving through the wilderness with the handful of survivors who still looked to him for leadership. He did not mention the killings, the raids on settler cabins, or the growing price on his head that made him one of the most wanted men in the territory. Some truths were too heavy to share with someone already carrying so much pain. "We are both ghosts now," he said finally, wrapping his blanket around her shoulders as the night grew colder. "Both marked for death by people who cannot see past the color of our skin or the choices we have made. The question is, do we haunt this place forever, or do we find a way to become human again?" It was a question that had plagued him for months, the growing certainty that he was becoming something monstrous in his quest for survival, and he realized that finding Sarah might be the answer to prayers he had been afraid to voice. The blood moon was setting now, its crimson light fading to the silver of normal moonlight, and Mappa took it as a sign that the worst of the night's revelations were behind them. Sarah had fallen asleep against his shoulder, her breathing regular and strong enough to suggest that she would survive her ordeal. But survival was only the first challenge they would face. Dawn would bring new dangers, and the men who had hanged her would not give up easily once they discovered she was still alive. As he kept watch through the remaining hours of darkness, Mop found himself planning not just for Sarah's immediate survival but for something more ambitious and dangerous. Perhaps it was time to stop running, to stop being a ghost haunting the edges of a world that no longer wanted him. Perhaps it was time to find a place where ghosts could become human again, where the color of skin mattered less than the content of character. It would not be easy, and it would certainly not be safe, but looking down at the sleeping girl who had nearly died for defending his people, Mop realized that some things were worth the risk. The night wind carried the scent of coming snow, and Map pulled his coat tighter around both of them. Winter was coming to Wyoming territory, but for the first time in 3 years, he was not facing it alone. The first pale fingers of dawn crept across the Wyoming Badlands like ghostly scouts, announcing the arrival of a hostile army. Mop had not slept, his warrior's instincts keeping him alert through the long night as he watched the horizon for any sign of pursuit. Sarah stirred in his arms as the cold morning air bit through their shared blanket, her eyes fluttering open, to reveal pupils that were clearer and more focused than they had been the night before. The fever had broken sometime during the darkest hours, and though she was still weak, Mop could see that her spirit was returning along with her strength. "How long was I hanging there?" Sarah asked, her voice still rough but no longer the whispered croak of the previous night. As she sat up slowly, wincing at the pain in her wrists and shoulders, Mop studied her face in the growing light. The bruises were more visible now, dark purple marks along her jaw and temple that spoke of violence that had preceded her hanging. Someone had beaten her thoroughly before stringing her up, and the cruelty of it made his jaw clench with suppressed rage. Hard to say, Mop replied, helping her sit up against the rock wall. Your body shows maybe 2 days of exposure, but the rope burns suggest you fought the bindings for hours before exhaustion took you. He handed her his water canteen and watched as she drank carefully, her throat working against what must have been considerable pain. The men who did this, they wanted you to suffer. This wasn't justice, it was revenge. Sarah's hand trembled slightly as she lowered the canteen, and Mappy saw her eyes focus on something in the distance. Following her gaze, he spotted what had caught her attention. A thin column of smoke rising from the direction they had come, perhaps 5 miles back along the trail. It was too straight and controlled to be a natural fire, too early in the morning to be a cooking fire from passing travelers. Someone was burning something deliberately, and Mop had a sinking feeling he knew what it was. They're destroying the evidence, Sarah whispered, her face pale beneath the bruises. Jeremiah Colt, he's thorough like that. Papa used to say Colt was the kind of man who would burn down a forest to kill one snake, and then claim the forest. Attacked him first. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, but Mop could see it was not just the cold that made her shiver. If they're burning the hanging tree, it means they're planning to say I died in an Indian raid. Makes a better story than admitting they hanged a white woman for showing Christian charity. Mop felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. If Colt was already manufacturing a cover story, it meant the rancher was confident that Sarah would never live to contradict his version of events. More importantly, it meant that Colt had enough influence with the territorial authorities to make his story stick, regardless of what evidence might suggest otherwise. Men like that did not leave loose ends, and they certainly did not allow their victims to escape and spread inconvenient truths, as if summoned by Mop's dark thoughts. The sound of horses reached them across the morning stillness. Not the random wandering of wild mustangs or the purposeful but unhurried pace of travelers, but the organized rhythm of a search party moving with military precision. Mop counted at least 6 horses, possibly more, and they were following the same trail that had led him to the hanging tree. Someone with tracking skills was guiding them, someone who could read sign well enough to follow a single horse's passage through broken country. We need to move, Mop said, already beginning to pack their meager supplies. Can you ride? Sarah tested her arms gingerly, flexing her fingers and rotating her wrists despite the obvious pain. The bandages he had applied were already showing spots of fresh blood, but she nodded with a determination that impressed him. This was not a pampered ranch daughter who would collapse at the first sign of hardship, but a frontier woman who understood that sometimes survival required ignoring pain. I've been riding since I could walk, she said, accepting his help to stand. Papa said a woman in this country needed to be able to ride, shoot, and think fast, because you never knew which skill would save your life. She swayed slightly as the blood rushed from her head, but she steadied herself against the rock wall and remained upright. I just hope your horse doesn't mind carrying double, because I don't think I'm up for bareback riding in my condition. Mop's painted Mustang, a sturdy gelding he had named Wakina for its habit of charging into danger, was grazing calmly despite the approaching sounds of pursuit. The horse had been trained for war, accustomed to the noise and chaos of battle, and it took the addition of a second rider with the stolid acceptance of a veteran campaigner. Sarah settled behind Mop with a grace that spoke of years in the saddle, her arms circling his waist as he guided Wakina away from their shelter and deeper into the maze of canyons that carved up this section of the Badlands behind them. The sounds of the search party grew more distinct. Mop could hear voices now, men calling to each other as they examined the ground around the hanging tree. One voice rose above the others, harsh and commanding, and Sarah's grip on his waist tightened. Involuntarily, "That's Colt," she whispered in his ear. "He's found something." Mop urged Joaquina into a faster pace, weaving between the scattered boulders and stunted trees that offered the only cover in this desolate landscape, the sound that chilled Mop's blood was not a shout of discovery, but something far worse, the deep baying of hunting hounds. Colt had brought dogs, bloodhounds trained to follow a scent trail across miles of wilderness. No amount of skill or knowledge of the country could hide them from animals whose noses could detect a day-old trail with absolute precision. They were no longer just being pursued. They were being hunted like dangerous game, and the hounds would not stop until they found their quarry, or died in the attempt. Mop drove Joaquina hard through the narrow confines of what the local whites called Devil's Canyon, a twisting gorge that cut through the heart of the Badlands like a scar left by some ancient wound. The walls rose sheer on both sides, carved from red sandstone by millennia of flash floods, and the trail was barely wide enough for a single horse. It was dangerous country even in good weather, the kind of place where a single misstep could send horse and rider tumbling to their deaths on the rocks below. But Mop knew these canyons better than most, having used them as hiding places during his 3 years as a fugitive. He knew which side passages led to dead ends and which opened onto hidden valleys where a man could disappear for weeks at a time. More importantly, he knew where the echoes would confuse the sounds of their passage, making it difficult for their pursuers to determine their exact location. It was a temporary advantage at best, but in a situation like this, temporary advantages were all that stood between life and death. Sarah proved to be an excellent riding companion, shifting her weight automatically to help Joaquina navigate the treacherous footing without any instruction from Moppy. She did not chatter nervously or ask endless questions about their destination, understanding instinctively that survival required silence and concentration. When Mop had guided them up a nearly invisible trail that switchbacked up the canyon wall, she leaned forward without being asked, helping the horse maintain its balance on the crumbling ledge. The sound of the hounds grew louder behind them, their baying echoing off the canyon walls in a cacophony that seemed to come from all directions at once. But there was something different about the sound now, a note of confusion that had not been there before. Mop allowed himself a grim smile as he realized what was happening. The dogs had reached the point where he and Sarah had crossed and recrossed Willow Creek, the small stream that ran through the bottom of the canyon. The water would break their scent trail, at least temporarily, forcing the handlers to cast about for the trail's continuation. "How long will that stop them?" Sarah asked, having noticed the change in the hounds' baying as well. Her voice remained steady despite their desperate situation, and Mop found himself increasingly impressed by her composure under pressure. Many warriors he had known would have been less calm in similar circumstances. "Not long enough," Mop replied honestly. "Maybe an hour if we're lucky, less if Colt has a tracker who knows his business. But it gives us time to reach the hidden camp where my people are waiting. Once we're there, the odds become more even." He did not mention that leading pursuers to his band's hidden refuge would put 14 other lives at risk, or that his warriors might not be willing to fight and die for a white woman they had never met. Some decisions could only be made when the moment arrived, and worry was a luxury they could not afford. The trail they followed was ancient, carved by countless generations of deer and elk seeking water in the canyon below. It was narrow and treacherous, with loose shale that shifted underfoot and sections where the path had been washed away entirely by spring floods. But it was also invisible from below, hidden by overhanging rock formations that created deep shadows even in full daylight. Unless their pursuers knew exactly where to look, they could pass directly beneath without ever suspecting that anyone had climbed above them. As they climbed higher into the Badlands, Mop began to see a different side of Sarah McCready than the broken victim he had cut down from the hanging tree. When Wakina stumbled on a patch of loose rock, she was off the horse's back and steadying him before Mop could react, her hands sure and gentle as she checked the animal for injury. When they stopped to rest at a natural spring hidden among the rocks, she immediately began gathering specific plants that Mop recognized as having medicinal properties. Willow bark for pain, wild sage for cleaning wounds, and this, she said, holding up a small flowering plant, is what the Lakota woman I helped called ghost medicine. She said it could stop bleeding and prevent infection better than anything the white doctors carried. Sarah looked up at him with eyes that held intelligence and determination in equal measure. Blue Dawn taught me quite a bit during the week she stayed with us. Papa said knowledge was never wasted, no matter where it came from. Mappa stared at her in surprise. Very few whites bothered to learn Indian medicine, and fewer still would admit to such knowledge in present company. That Sarah not only knew these plants but understood their proper use suggested a depth of relationship with Blue Dawn that went far beyond simple charity. She had taken the time to learn, to listen, to understand that his people possessed knowledge worth preserving. It was a level of respect that he had rarely encountered among whites, even those who claimed to be friendly to Indian causes. Blue Dawn is my cousin, Mop said quietly, watching Sarah's face for her reaction. She is the daughter of my mother's sister, and when her white husband beat her, she came to us for protection. We had to turn her away because harboring her would have brought the soldiers down on our whole band. I have carried the shame of that decision for months. He paused, studying the small pile of medicinal plants Sarah had gathered. You did what we could not do, and it cost you everything. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her fingers working automatically to strip the useful parts from the plants she had collected. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight of sadness that made her seem older than her years. Papa always said that doing the right thing rarely comes free, but that doesn't make it any less right. Blue Dawn lost her baby, but she lived. Sometimes that's the best outcome you can hope for in a world that seems determined to punish kindness. The sound of the hounds reached them again, closer now and more organized. Colt's tracker had found their trail and was leading the pack up the same ancient path they had used to escape the canyon floor. But there was something else mixed with the baying of the dogs, the sound of horses being pushed hard over difficult terrain. Someone was driving the pursuit at a pace that was dangerous for both animals and riders, suggesting a level of desperation that went beyond simple law enforcement. As they prepared to resume their flight, Sarah suddenly grabbed Mop's arm with a strength that surprised him. Her face had gone pale again, but this time it was not from physical weakness, but from a realization that clearly terrified her. There's something I didn't tell you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Something that makes this about more than just punishment for helping Blue Dawn. Mop waited, sensing that whatever revelation was coming would change the nature of their situation entirely. Sarah took a shaky breath and reached into the bodice of her torn dress, withdrawing a small leather pouch that had somehow survived her ordeal. With trembling fingers, she opened it and poured the contents into her palm, revealing what looked like ordinary pebbles until the morning light hit them and revealed their true nature. Gold, Mop said, understanding immediately why Colt's pursuit had taken on such desperate urgency. Where did you get these? The nuggets were substantial, more than a common laborer might see in a lifetime of wages, and they had the distinctive color and weight of high-grade ore. This was not panning gold, the kind of dust and flakes that most prospectors spent their lives chasing, but the real thing, the kind of strike that could make a man wealthy beyond his wildest dreams. Papa found them on our land, in a creek that runs down from the mountains, Sarah explained, her words tumbling over each other in her haste to get the story out. He didn't tell anyone at first, wanted to be sure it was a real strike and not just a few scattered nuggets that had washed down from somewhere else. But when he was sure, he went to the territorial capital to file the proper claims. That's when everything started to go wrong. Sarah's story unfolded like a nightmare of greed and corruption that was all too familiar in the territories. Patrick Macready had filed his mining claims according to the law, but Jeremiah Colt had friends in the territorial government who were willing to declare the claims invalid on technicalities. When Patrick had protested, producing documentation that proved his legal ownership of the land, Colt had decided that eliminating the Macreadys entirely was simpler than fighting them in court. Papa hid most of the gold before they came for us, Sarah continued, glancing nervously at the approaching sounds of pursuit. But he gave me these pieces and made me promise that if anything happened to him, I would get them to the federal authorities in Cheyenne. He said it was the only way to prove that Colt was behind everything, because these nuggets came from a very specific part of our creek, and anyone who knew geology could prove they originated on our land. Mop felt the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with sickening clarity. This was not about frontier justice or racial hatred, though those elements were certainly present. This was about gold, about the kind of money that could buy territorial governors and federal judges, the kind of wealth that men would kill for without hesitation. Sarah was not just a witness to murder. She was the key to exposing a conspiracy that probably reached all the way to Washington. The sound of gunfire echoed through the canyons, but it was not directed at them. Instead, Mop heard the distinctive crack of rifles being fired into the air, the universal signal for a parley or surrender. Colt was calling for them to stop and talk, which meant either he was confident that they had no way to escape or he was desperate enough to risk negotiation rather than simply hunting them down like animals. He wants to make a deal, Sarah said, her voice tight with anger. That's how Colt operates. First he tries intimidation, then violence, and when those fail, he offers to split the profits with anyone who might cause him trouble. Papa said Colt had bought off half the territorial government that way. She looked at Mop with eyes that held no illusion about their situation. But there's no deal he can offer that would let us live. We know too much, and he can't risk us talking to the wrong people. Mop studied the terrain ahead, calculating distances and angles with the automatic precision of a man who had spent years in similar situations. They were perhaps 2 miles from the hidden valley where his band was camped, but the trail between here and there offered little cover and no alternative routes. If Colt had men stationed at the obvious escape routes, they could find themselves trapped in a crossfire with no possibility of retreat. There is another way, Mop said slowly, an idea forming that was so dangerous it bordered on insanity. But it requires trust, and it requires you to be willing to risk everything on the chance that my people will accept you as one of us. He turned to face Sarah directly, studying her bruised but determined features. Once we reach my band, there will be no going back to the white world. You will be Sarah Macready no more, but someone else entirely, someone who exists only in the stories we tell around our fires. Sarah did not hesitate. The white world has already tried to kill me for showing mercy to your people. If your people are willing to accept me, then I choose them over the civilization that put a rope around my neck for doing what any decent person should do. She tucked the gold nuggets back into their pouch and secured it in her dress. Besides, someone needs to live to tell the truth about what Jeremiah Colt did to my father, and how the territorial government helped him do it. The sound of approaching horses was very close now, close enough that Mop could hear individual voices, and the jingle of spurs and bridle hardware. But mixed with those familiar sounds was something else, something that made his blood run cold with recognition. War cries, the distinctive battle calls of Lakota warriors, were echoing from the direction of his hidden camp. His people were under attack, and he was trapped miles away with no way to help them. My people, Mappa whispered, his face going ashen as the sounds of battle reached them across the intervening distance. The gunfire was more sustained now, Not the random shots of a hunting party, but the organized volleys of a military engagement. Someone had found his band's hidden refuge, and from the sound of things, they were outnumbered and fighting for their lives. Sarah's hand found his arm, her grip strong despite her injuries. "This is my fault," she said, her voice thick with guilt. "Colt must have known you would try to reach your people. He's using me as bait to draw you into a trap." Her eyes were bright with unshed tears, but her voice remained steady. "You have to go to them. Leave me here, and maybe you can still save some of your warriors." But Mop was already shaking his head, his jaw set with a determination that surprised even him. 3 years of running, 3 years of watching his people die one by one while he failed to protect them, had taught him that some choices were impossible to live with. He could not abandon Sarah to certain death any more than he could ignore his people's desperate need, but neither could he save both without risking everything he had left. "There is a third option," he said, his voice taking on the tone he had used when leading war parties against the cavalry. "We go forward, not back. Colt has divided his forces, some to attack my people, and some to pursue us. That means both. Groups are smaller than they would be otherwise, and neither is expecting us to attack rather than run." He helped Sarah back onto Wakina's back, his movements quick and efficient. "Your gold proves Colt's guilt, but only if we can get it to someone who will act on that evidence. That means we ride for Cheyenne, not into Colt's trap." Sarah looked back toward the sound of gunfire, her face torn between relief at their escape and anguish at the cost. "Your people ... My people are warriors," Mop said, though the words tasted like ashes in his mouth. "They knew this day might come, and they are prepared for it. But their sacrifice will mean nothing if we allow Colt to cover up his crimes and claim their deaths were just another Indian raid. The only way to honor them is to make sure the truth survives, even if we do not." As they rode away from the sounds of battle, Mop felt something die inside him, some last connection to the man he had been before the war changed everything. He was no longer Mop the warrior, protector of his people, and keeper of their traditions. He was something new, something that had no name in either Lakota or English, a man caught between worlds who belonged fully to neither. But looking at Sarah's determined profile as she scanned the horizon for signs of pursuit, he realized that perhaps belonging to a world was less important than belonging to another person who understood the cost of doing what was right. The Wyoming Badlands stretched endlessly before them, harsh and unforgiving as the choices that had brought them to this moment. Behind them, smoke rose from 2 separate fires: the hanging tree that had nearly claimed Sarah's life and the hidden valley where Mop's people made their last stand. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and the slim hope that justice might still be possible in a world that seemed determined to reward cruelty and punish compassion. But for the first time in 3 years, Mop was not riding alone, and that made all the difference in the world. 3 days of hard riding through trackless wilderness had brought Mop and Sarah to the skeletal remains of what had once been Silver Creek, a boomtown that had died as quickly as it was born when the Silver Vein played out in 1874. Now only weathered wooden buildings and rusted mining equipment remained, creating a perfect maze of hiding places for fugitives who knew how to move unseen through the shadows of abandoned dreams. The wind whistled through broken windows and collapsed roofs, creating an eerie symphony that masked the sound of their approach as they guided Wakina through the debris-strewn main street. Sarah slid down from the horse's back with movements that were steadier than they had been 3 days ago, though Mop could see she was still favoring her injured wrists. The rest and regular meals of dried meat and wild berries had restored some of her strength, but more importantly, the shared hardships of their flight had forged a partnership that went deeper than mere survival. She no longer flinched when he moved suddenly or spoke in Lakota to his horse, and he had begun to rely on her keen eyes and frontier knowledge in ways that surprised him. There, Sarah pointed to a building that had once been the town's general store. Its false front still intact, though the windows were long gone. That one has a root cellar. I can see the storm doors behind the loading dock. Her ability to read the landscape and identify useful features had proven invaluable during their journey, and Mop had come to trust her instincts about such things. She understood the architecture of frontier survival in ways that his own woodland skills sometimes missed. As they settled into the abandoned store's cellar, a space that still smelled faintly of potatoes and preserved meat, Mop finally allowed himself to examine the gold nuggets that had transformed their flight from a simple rescue into something far more dangerous. By the light of a carefully shielded candle, the metal gleamed with the unmistakable fire that had driven men to cross continents and kill their own brothers. Each piece was roughly the size of a robin's egg, and Mop's experience trading with white prospectors told him they were looking at more wealth than most people would see in several lifetimes. "Your father was a brave man," Mop said, rolling one of the nuggets between his fingers. "Most whites would have sold out their own mother for this much gold. But he chose to protect it, and you, instead of making a deal with Colt," he handed the nugget back to Sarah, noting how her fingers trembled slightly as she accepted it. "The question is, what do we do with it now? Cheyenne is still 4 days away, and Colt's men are between us and any chance of reaching the territorial authorities." Sarah's response surprised him. Instead of despair or uncertainty, her eyes lit up with an idea that seemed to energize her, despite their desperate circumstances. "We don't have to reach Cheyenne," she said, her voice taking on the excited tone of someone who had just solved a complex puzzle. "There's someone else who can help us, someone Colt doesn't know about, because Papa kept it secret, even from me, until just before they came for us." Sarah's revelation unfolded like the answer to a prayer Mop had not dared to voice. Hidden in the cellar of their own burned ranch house, Patrick McCready had concealed more than gold. He had also hidden correspondence with a network of abolitionists and Indian rights activists who had been smuggling escaped slaves to freedom before the war and were now helping displaced Native Americans find sanctuary in Canada or Mexico. The leader of this network was someone whose identity would shock both the territorial government and the military authorities, who thought they had crushed all organized resistance to their policies. "Sister Margaret Flanagan," Sarah said, watching Mop's face for his reaction. "She runs the mission school at Hawk's Nest, about 20 miles north of here. Officially, she's just a Catholic nun trying to educate Indian children and convert them to proper Christian ways. Unofficially, she's been moving people north across the border for almost 10 years, and the authorities have never suspected, because she hides behind her habit and her reputation for piety." Mop knew of Sister Margaret by reputation, though he had never met her personally. She was legendary among his people as one of the few whites who treated Indians as human beings, rather than obstacles to be removed or souls to be saved. Mission school was said to be a place where Native children could learn white ways without being forced to abandon their own heritage. A revolutionary concept in a territory where most education was designed to destroy rather than preserve indigenous culture. "But why would she help us?" Mop asked, though he was already beginning to see the possibilities. A nun who helps fugitive Indians is one thing, but harboring a wanted warrior and a white woman carrying evidence of territorial corruption is something else entirely. That's the kind of risk that could get her sent back to Ireland in chains. He studied Sarah's face in the candlelight, noting the way her expression had changed from desperate hope to something approaching confidence. Sarah's smile was the first genuine expression of joy he had seen from her since their flight began. "Because she knew my mother," she said simply. "Before Mama married Papa and came to America, she was Margaret Flanagan's sister Mary. They wrote to each other for years, and when Papa decided to file those mining claims, Mama insisted that he tell Sister Margaret everything in case something happened to them. She's not just a stranger who might help us out of Christian charity, she's family. The implications hit Mop like a physical blow. If Sister Margaret was Sarah's aunt, and if she had been corresponding with Patrick McCready about the gold claims, then she already knew about Colt's conspiracy, and had probably been waiting for some word about what had happened to her sister's family. More importantly, she would have the resources and connections to get Sarah's evidence to people who could act on it, people who were beyond Colt's reach and influence. Leaving Silver Creek required careful timing and even more careful planning. Colt's men had not given up their pursuit, and the abandoned town's obvious value as a hiding place meant it would eventually be searched thoroughly. But Mappa's 3 years as a fugitive had taught him patience, and he spent hours studying the patterns of dust clouds on the horizon before determining the safest route to Sister Margaret's mission. The 20 miles to Hawks Nest lay across some of the most exposed terrain in the territory, rolling prairie that offered little cover and excellent visibility for anyone with field glasses and a good vantage point. But Mop knew that the same openness that made the journey dangerous also made it possible to spot pursuit from miles away, and he had identified a route that followed the low ground between ridges, using creek beds and buffalo wallows to stay. Hidden from casual observation, Sarah proved her worth again during this stage of their journey, her knowledge of the local geography filling in gaps that Mappa warrior training had left uncovered. She knew which water sources were seasonal and which were permanent, which ranch boundaries were strictly enforced, and which were more theoretical than practical. Most importantly, she understood the daily routines of the scattered homesteaders and ranchers whose land they would have to cross, knowledge that allowed them to time their movement to avoid unwanted encounters. "There's something else you should know about Sister Margaret," Sarah said as they rested during the heat of the afternoon, hidden in a grove of cottonwoods beside a meandering creek. "She's not just running an underground railroad for people. She's also been documenting what's happening to the tribes, keeping records of massacres and forced relocations that the government claims never happened. Papa said she's got enough evidence to bring down half the territorial administration, if it ever reaches the right people in Washington." This revelation added another layer of complexity to their situation. If Sister Margaret was gathering evidence of government atrocities against Native Americans, then Colt's gold conspiracy might be just one piece of a much larger puzzle of corruption and violence. The nun might see Sarah's evidence not just as a way to bring one crooked rancher to justice, but as a key piece in a much broader campaign for reform and accountability. The sound of distant gunfire interrupted Mop's thoughts, coming from the direction they had traveled rather than the direction they were heading. Someone was engaged in a running battle perhaps 5 miles behind them, and the sustained nature of the shooting suggested it was more than a simple hunting accident or random encounter with bandits. Colt was still hunting them, but he was also fighting someone else, which meant their flight had complicated an already dangerous situation in ways they could not fully understand. Hawks Nest mission materialized out of the prairie heat shimmer, like something from a fever dream. Its whitewashed adobe buildings and cultivated gardens, creating an oasis of civilization in the midst of endless grassland. But as they approached the outskirts of the settlement, Mop began to notice details that suggested this was no ordinary religious outpost. The buildings were positioned with military precision, offering clear fields of fire and multiple escape routes. The gardens were surrounded by walls that were higher and thicker than necessary for keeping out rabbits, and the bell tower of the chapel would make an excellent observation post for spotting approaching riders. Sister Margaret Flanagan herself was waiting for them in the mission's courtyard, as if she had been expecting their arrival for days. She was a small woman, probably in her 40s, with the kind of weathered complexion that spoke of years under the prairie sun. Her habit was practical rather than ornate, modified for frontier conditions with shorter skirts and sturdier boots. And her hands showed the calluses of someone who did physical labor rather than just supervising others. But it was her eyes that impressed Mop most. Intelligent and compassionate, but with a hardness that suggested she had seen enough injustice to make her willing to take considerable risks to fight it. "Sarah, child," the nun said, her Irish accent still strong despite years in America, "your mother would be proud of the woman you've become, standing up for what's right, even when it costs you everything." She embraced her niece with genuine warmth, but Mop noticed that her eyes never stopped scanning the horizon for signs of pursuit. "And you must be Moppy. Your reputation precedes you, though I must say the stories make you out to be considerably more bloodthirsty than you appear." The inside of Sister Margaret's private quarters revealed the true nature of her operation. The walls were covered with maps marked with routes and safe houses, and her desk was stacked with correspondence from contacts across the territory and beyond. But most impressive was the collection of documents she showed them, carefully organized testimonies from Indian survivors of massacres, records of broken treaties, and evidence of systematic corruption that reached from local Indian agents all the way to the Bureau of Indian Affairs in Washington. "Your father's gold is important," Sister Margaret told Sarah as she examined the nuggets, "but it's just one piece of a much larger story we've been trying to tell for years. Jeremiah Colt is a symptom, not the disease. The real problem is a system that treats both Indians and decent white folks as obstacles to be removed whenever they interfere with certain people's profits." She locked the gold in a hidden safe behind a false panel in her desk. "But with this evidence, we might finally be able to get the federal authorities to take action against the whole corrupt network." Mott found himself studying the nun with growing respect and no small amount of suspicion. In his experience, whites who claimed to be helping Indians usually had their own agenda, and he had learned to be wary of anyone who seemed too good to be true. But Sister Margaret's operation was clearly real, and the testimony she had collected represented years of careful, dangerous work that could only have been motivated by genuine commitment to justice that, as Sister Margaret explained the scope of her underground network, Mott began to understand that their flight from Colt had inadvertently brought them into contact with something much larger than either of them had imagined. The mission was just one station in a chain that stretched from Mexico to Canada, moving displaced Native Americans, escaped slaves, and political refugees to safety while simultaneously gathering evidence of the systematic violence and corruption that plagued the frontier territories. "We've been watching Jeremiah Colt for almost 2 years," Sister Margaret explained, spreading a detailed map across her desk. "He's been using his political connections to steal Indian land, claim it for mineral rights, then sell those rights to Eastern investors who never bothered to verify that the claims are legitimate. Your father wasn't his first victim, Sarah, just the first one who was brave enough to document what was happening and try to fight back through legal channels." The map showed a web of corruption that extended far beyond Wyoming territory, reaching into Colorado, Montana, and the Dakotas. Colt was apparently just one member of a larger conspiracy that included territorial officials, military officers, and business interests that saw the Indian Wars as an opportunity for massive profit rather than a tragic necessity. They had been systematically provoking conflicts, then using the resulting violence to justify land seizures and military contracts that enriched everyone involved except the people who actually lived on the disputed territories. "But now we have something we've never had before," the nun continued, her eyes bright with excitement. "We have a white witness to their methods, someone who survived their attempt to silence her and can testify about their tactics in a court of law. Combined with the gold that proves the financial motive, your testimony could be the key to bringing down the entire network." Sarah looked uncomfortable with the praise, shifting in her chair as if the weight of expectation was too much to bear. "I'm not a hero, Aunt Margaret," she said quietly. "I just did what anyone decent person would do when they saw someone in need. And if Mop hadn't found me, I'd be dead now, and none of this evidence would matter." She glanced at Mop with an expression that was difficult to read. "He's the one who risked everything to save a stranger." Mop felt heat rise in his cheeks at the unexpected praise, but before he could respond, the mission's bell began to ring in a pattern that was clearly some kind of signal. Sister Margaret was on her feet instantly, moving to the window with the quick efficiency of someone who had faced similar alarms many times before. Through the glass, Mop could see riders approaching from the south, perhaps a dozen men spread out in a formation that suggested military training rather than casual travel. "Colt's found us," Sister Margaret said, her voice calm despite the obvious danger. "But he's made a mistake. He's brought territorial militia instead of just his own men, which means he's had to make this official somehow. That gives us options we wouldn't have otherwise." She moved to her desk and began pulling documents from hidden compartments, working with the practiced efficiency of someone who had prepared for this moment many times. "Sarah, there's a passage under the chapel that leads to the cemetery. Follow it to the crypt marked Stevens, and wait there until you hear 3 bells, then move to the rendezvous point we discussed." But Sarah was shaking her head before her aunt finished speaking. "I'm not running anymore," she said, her voice carrying a firmness that reminded Mop of her father's stubborn idealism. "I'm tired of letting other people pay the price for my survival. If Colt wants to make this official, then let's make it official. I'll face him in front of his militia and tell them exactly what he did to my family." Mop admired her courage, but he also understood the tactical realities better than she did. "They didn't come here to arrest you," he told her gently. "They came to silence you permanently and blame it on the dangerous Indian who kidnapped you. Colt's not planning a trial. He's planning a massacre that will make him look like a hero for rescuing a white woman from savage captivity." Sister Margaret nodded grimly. "Mop's right. But there is another option, one that could turn Colt's plan against him." She pulled a final document from her desk, a letter bearing official federal seals. "I've been corresponding with a federal marshal named Thomas Brennan, a man who's been investigating territorial corruption for months. He's been waiting for exactly this kind of evidence, and he's only 2 days' ride from here with a detachment of federal troops who answer directly to Washington, not to the territorial government." The sound of approaching horses was getting closer, and Mop could hear voices calling for the mission's surrender. But Sister Margaret seemed strangely calm as she sealed Sarah's gold and Patrick McCready's documents in a waterproof packet. "There's a way to get this evidence to Marshal Brennan," she said, "but it requires someone who knows the country well enough to evade pursuit for 2 days. Someone who can move through hostile territory without being detected." Mop understood immediately what she was asking and the impossibility of the choice it represented. He could take the evidence and run, using his skills as a warrior to stay ahead of pursuit until he reached the federal marshal. But that would mean abandoning Sarah and Sister Margaret to face Colt's revenge alone. And he had seen enough of the rancher's methods to know that their deaths would be neither quick nor merciful. Alternatively, he could stay and fight, but that would doom the evidence to destruction and allow Colt's conspiracy to continue unchallenged. "There is a third option," Sarah said, her voice taking on the same determined tone Mop had heard when she first decided to trust him. "We split up, but not the way you're thinking. Mop takes the evidence to the marshal, but I go with him. Aunt Margaret stays here and tells Colt that we forced her to help us at gunpoint, that she's an innocent victim of savage violence just like everyone expects." She looked at her aunt with eyes that held both love and apology. "It's not fair to ask you to lie for us, but it's the only way to keep you safe while ensuring the evidence reaches the right people." Sister Margaret's smile was sad but proud. "Child, I've been lying to territorial authorities for 10 years in the service of a higher truth. A few more lies in a righteous cause won't weigh too heavily on my conscience." She handed the evidence packet to Mape along with detailed directions. "To Marshal Brennan's camp. But you'd better move fast. Once Colt realizes you've escaped again, he'll mobilize every corrupt official and outlaw sympathizer in the territory to stop you from reaching the federal authorities. as they prepared to slip away through the underground passage that connected the mission to the cemetery. Map found himself looking back at the woman who had risked everything to help them. Sister Margaret Flanagan stood in her simple habit, surrounded by the evidence of years of dangerous work in the service of justice, and he realized that he was seeing true courage in action. She was not a warrior in the traditional sense, but she was fighting a war nonetheless, and her weapons were truth and compassion rather than rifles and war paint. The sound of splintering wood indicated that Colt's men had lost patience with negotiation and were breaking down the mission's main door. But by then, Mop and Sarah were already moving through the darkness beneath the chapel, following a route that had been used by dozens of fugitives over the years to escape, the kind of frontier justice that recognized no law higher than the will of the strongest. Behind them, Sister Margaret began to scream for help in a performance that would have done credit to any stage actress, playing the role of a terrified nun whose mission had been invaded by savage Indians and their white accomplice Dot as they emerged from the crypt into the cemetery's moonlit silence. Mop realized that they were no longer just fugitives running from one man's vengeance. They had become part of something larger, a network of resistance that spanned the continent and challenged the very foundations of how America treated its inconvenient populations. The evidence they carried could change everything, but only if they could survive the next 2 days and reach Marshall Brennan before Colt's corruption destroyed them all. The first sign that their escape had triggered something far beyond Colt's personal vendetta came at dawn on their second day of flight toward Marshall Brennan's camp. From their hiding place in a stand of pine trees overlooking the Sweetwater River Valley, Map and Sarah watched in growing horror as a coordinated network of signal fires blazed to life across the landscape. The fires stretched from horizon to horizon in a carefully planned pattern, each one positioned to relay messages faster than any horse could carry them. Sarah pressed herself closer to Mop as they counted the signal fires, her face pale with realization. "That's the Territorial Militia's emergency communication network," she whispered. "Papa told me about it after the Sand Creek troubles. They only activate it when they're hunting someone they consider a threat to territorial security." This was no longer about covering up Colt's crimes. Somehow, their flight with Sister Margaret's evidence had been transformed into a matter of territorial survival, which meant every law enforcement officer and military unit between here and Cheyenne would soon be mobilized to stop them. The sound of approaching hoofbeats revealed the disciplined rhythm of a military column, riding in formation with professional precision. Through the trees, dust clouds rose from multiple directions, all converging on their area with coordinated efficiency. They were no longer being pursued. They were being hunted by the full resources of the territorial government. Worse still, Wakina was favoring his left front hoof, a stone bruise that would make hard riding impossible. They were about to face the most dangerous pursuit of their lives on foot. The Sweetwater River represented both opportunity and obstacle. The broad, shallow stream was one of the few reliable water sources in this part of the territory, but the established fords would be obvious choke points for ambushes. Mop remembered a third option from his years of hunting along the banks, a gravel bar crossing that didn't appear on any military map, but might get them across without using the established crossing points. The sound of gunfire erupted from Eagle Ford, confirming Mop's suspicions about the ambush waiting there. The shots came in organized volleys, suggesting some other group had stumbled into the trap meant for them. Sarah flinched at each shot, knowing innocent people were dying because of the manhunt their flight had triggered. The gravel bar crossing proved treacherous. Spring snowmelt had raised the water level and strengthened the current, turning what should have been a simple wade into a dangerous struggle. Sarah fought her way across the slippery rocks with grim determination despite the icy water that rose nearly to her waist. But the crossing cost them precious time and energy, and soon they could hear the distinctive baying of tracking hounds, dogs trained to follow scent trails across water. "We need to split up," Sarah said, wringing water from her hair. "They want you dead and me captured. If I surrender and you take the evidence alone." But Mop was already shaking his head. "We stay together," he said with finality. "I've lost too many people by leaving them behind. Whatever happens, we face it together." The hills proved riddled with caves and hidden canyons carved through soft sandstone by ancient water. But as they worked deeper into the maze of stone passages, smoke from a concealed fire led them to an unexpected discovery. Blue Dawn, the young Lakota woman Sarah had helped deliver her stillborn child, sat beside the fire nursing a fresh bullet wound in her shoulder. Her face was gaunt with exhaustion, but her eyes blazed with fury. Beside her lay two bodies, one territorial militia, one civilian scout, both killed with arrows fired at close range. "They killed my husband," Blue Dawn said in Lakota, her voice flat with grief that had moved beyond tears. "Henry tried to protect me when the soldiers came, told them I was his wife under his protection. They shot him down like a dog and said no white man who married a squaw deserved to live. Henry Blackwood, the traitor who had once beaten Blue Dawn, had apparently been transformed by guilt and grief into a protective husband, trying to make amends when the manhunt swept through their homestead. They came looking for information about the white woman who helped birth my baby," Blue Dawn continued in English. "Said they needed to know everything about people who had corrupted me with savage sympathies. Henry told them to go to hell. That any woman who would help a stranger in need was worth a dozen of their kind." The revelation hit Mop like a physical blow. Someone had provided detailed information about everyone involved in helping Blue Dawn. Information that could only have come from someone present during those events. "Sister Margaret," Sarah whispered, her face going white. "They have her, and they made her talk." Blue Dawn's next words confirmed their worst fears. "The nun is dead. But before she died, she managed to get word to others in her network. The marshal you seek has been told that you are dangerous criminals fleeing with stolen government documents. A price has been put on your heads that will make every bounty hunter in the territory hunt you like wild animals." Blue Dawn showed them a wanted poster bearing crude but recognizable sketches of both Mop and Sarah. According to the official version, Mop was a renegade warrior who had murdered Patrick McCready and kidnapped his daughter, while Sarah was either his willing accomplice or a victim of savage brainwashing. The psychological warfare was brilliant in its cruelty. By turning them into monsters in the public imagination, the territorial authorities had isolated them from every possible source of support. "There is still one option," Blue Dawn said. "My brother Standing Wolf leads warriors who refuse the reservation. They're camped in the Owl Creek Mountains, 30 miles north. If we can reach them, they'll give us sanctuary and help us fight to Canada." The choice was stark: continue toward Marshal Brennan's camp, knowing it was probably a trap, or accept sanctuary with Standing Wolf's band while abandoning any chance of justice. Sarah's answer surprised both companions. "I want to see the evidence first," she said steadily. "Before we decide anything, I want to look at what we've been carrying and see if there's something we missed, some way to prove our innocence." She reached for the waterproof packet they had guarded throughout their flight. "Maybe Sister Margaret hid something we haven't discovered yet." Examination of Sister Margaret's evidence packet revealed layers of planning that spoke to the nun's experience with betrayal. Hidden beneath the obvious documents was a second layer written in code based on Latin prayer texts. It took Sarah's knowledge of Catholic liturgy and Mop's eye for patterns to decipher the hidden messages, but what they found changed everything. Sister Margaret had been expecting betrayal from within her own network. The coded messages revealed she had identified a federal infiltrator, feeding information to territorial authorities for months, Marshal Thomas Brennan himself. "He's been working for them all along," Sarah read, her voice hollow. "Feeding information to cults people and ensuring anyone who might expose the conspiracy disappears before they can testify." But the messages also contained a backup plan. Hidden in the Owl Creek Mountains was a cache of evidence, including physical proof that couldn't be dismissed by corrupt officials, plus names of federal officials in Washington who were investigating independently and would act on solid evidence, if delivered safely. She planned for this, Mop said with admiration. She knew her network would be compromised, so she created a hidden fallback. The cache was near Standing Wolf's camp. If they could reach him, they could recover the evidence and still expose the truth. The journey to the Owl Creek Mountains would take them through dangerous territory, where terrain itself was an enemy. But it also offered advantages, places where knowledge could overcome superior numbers. Blue Dawn proved invaluable despite her injury. Her childhood memories, including dozens of hiding places where a small group could evade large pursuing forces. First test came at Widow's Gap, a narrow pass offering the only practical route through this section. Mop's scouting revealed the expected ambush, territorial militia, and bounty hunters positioned to control the pass. "We go around," Sarah suggested. "But alternative routes would cost days they didn't have." "There is another way," Mop said, pointing to the nearly vertical stone wall rising above the pass. "We don't go around or through. We go over it." The climb that followed tested every skill Mop had learned, every lesson about moving silently through dangerous terrain. Sarah proved her frontier toughness again, following him up barely existing handholds and across ledges where one misstep meant death. Blue Dawn endured the pain with warrior determination. From the ridge above Widow's Gap, they could see the full scope of the manhunt, military units at every crossing point, civilian volunteers patrolling between positions. It was a net designed to catch every escape route, but also a net with holes that could be exploited by people willing to take suicidal risks. As they began their descent on the far side, Mop felt something changing. They were no longer just running. They were fighting back, using the mountains as weapons against their hunters. For the first time since cutting Sarah from that tree, he felt something that might have been hope. The odds were still impossible, and the dangers ahead greater than anything yet faced, but they were no longer helpless victims. They had become something more dangerous, fugitives with a plan and the skills to execute it. The hidden valley where Standing Wolf's band had made their refuge lay, nestled between towering peaks like a secret preserved from the outside world. Ancient petroglyphs covered the canyon walls, telling stories of hunts and battles from generations past, while natural hot springs created pools of steaming water that had sustained life here for countless winters. But the 30 warriors who called this place home were not living in peaceful isolation. They were preparing for war. Standing Wolf himself proved to be nothing like what Sarah had expected from Blue Dawn's descriptions. Instead of the weathered, older warrior she had imagined, he was barely 25, with intelligent eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of their arrival and calculate its implications. His English was flawless, acquired during 2 years at the Carlisle Industrial School, before he escaped back to his people, and his understanding of white military tactics was as thorough as any West Point graduate's. "My sister tells me you carry proof of the territorial conspiracy," he said without preamble as they sat around his fire. "But she also tells me that every federal authority who might act on such proof has been compromised or eliminated." His warriors formed a silent circle. Around them, their faces painted for war in a way that suggested they had already made certain decisions about their future. "The question before us is simple. Do we die fighting a hopeless battle for justice, or do we disappear into Canada and live to preserve our people's stories for future generations?" The weight of that choice pressed down on the small gathering like the mountain peaks that surrounded them. Sarah found herself studying the faces of men who had already sacrificed everything for freedom, warriors who had chosen exile and constant danger over the slow death of reservation life. These were not naive idealists but hardened fighters who understood the cost of resistance and their willingness to consider her evidence spoke to a desperation that went beyond simple survival. Blue Dawn spoke first, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned her place among these warriors through blood and sacrifice. The white woman's father died protecting Indian land rights. She herself nearly died for showing mercy. To our people, if we turn away from this chance to expose the truth about what has been done to us, then we become accomplices to our own destruction. Her wounded shoulder was testament to the price she had already paid for involvement in this fight, but her resolve seemed unshaken by the pain. Standing, Wolf's response revealed the complexity of leadership that few whites ever understood about. Indian war chiefs. Sister, your courage honors our ancestors, but my responsibility is to these 30 men and their families hidden in the northern camps. If we involve ourselves in this white woman's fight, we invite destruction not just upon ourselves but upon every person who depends on us for protection. He gestured toward the petroglyphs on the canyon walls. These stones remember 1,000 years of our people's struggles. Will our actions ensure that future generations exist to read them? The argument might have continued indefinitely, but the discovery that Sister Margaret's hidden cache was located within the sacred burial grounds of Standing Wolf's ancestors changed the entire dynamic of their discussion. The location was not accidental. The nun had chosen it precisely because it was a place that would be protected by spiritual taboos, as well as physical isolation. Somewhere that territorial authorities would never think to search, even if they learned of its existence. Mop felt his breath catch as Standing Wolf led them through a narrow passage, behind a waterfall to reveal a natural cathedral carved from living rock. The burial platforms of ancient chiefs lined the walls, their remains wrapped in buffalo robes and decorated with the weapons and tools that had defined their earthly lives. But hidden among these sacred relics was a modern intrusion, a steel strongbox that seemed to glow with unnatural importance in the flickering light of their torches. The contents of Sister Margaret's cache exceeded even their wildest hopes. Along with meticulously documented evidence of the territorial conspiracy, the box contained physical artifacts that would be impossible to dismiss or explain away. Colt's own correspondence with territorial officials, written in his distinctive hand and bearing his personal seal. Photographs of mining operations on stolen Indian land, complete with surveyors' marks that proved the claims were filed illegally. Most damning of all, a ledger book recording payments made to corrupt federal officials, including Marshall Brennan's name alongside sums that dwarfed a lifetime of legitimate wages. This changes everything, Sarah whispered as she examined a letter bearing the signature of the territorial governor himself, ordering the elimination of troublesome elements who threatened the stability of mining interests. This isn't just about Colt anymore. This evidence proves that the conspiracy reaches all the way to Washington, that everything that's happened to your people and mine has been orchestrated by men who see murder as just another business expense. But Standing Wolf's expression remained grim despite the significance of their discovery. Evidence means nothing without someone in authority willing to act on it, he said, carefully returning the documents to their protective wrappings. Sister Margaret died trying to get this information to people who could use it. Her death proves that the corruption runs too deep for normal channels of justice to function. He looked directly at Sarah with eyes that seemed to see into her soul. The question is whether you are prepared to take the kind of risks that real justice requires. The answer to Standing Wolf's question came sooner than any of them expected, announced by the thunder of cavalry hooves echoing through the canyon as a massive force of territorial militia surrounded their hidden refuge. But this was no random discovery or lucky guess by their pursuers. The precision of the attack and the coordination of multiple units revealed that someone had provided detailed intelligence about the valley's layout and defenses. From their vantage point on the canyon rim, Mop could see the full scope of the force arrayed against them. 3 companies of territorial cavalry, supported by artillery pieces that had been hauled up the mountain trails during the night, along with civilian volunteers whose bloodthirsty enthusiasm was visible even at a distance. It was enough firepower to reduce the entire valley to rubble, and the careful positioning of the units suggested that someone with military training had planned this assault. "How did they find us?" Blue Dawn asked, her voice tight with the kind of controlled panic that preceded desperate action. The question was answered by a familiar voice echoing across the canyon, amplified by a speaking trumpet that had been positioned to reach every corner of the hidden valley. Jeremiah Colt himself had come to finish what he had started, and his words carried the confidence of a man who believed he held all the advantages. "Mop of the Lakota," Colt's voice boomed. "Across the stone walls, you have something that belongs to me, and I've come to collect it. Send out the white woman and the documents she stole, and I'll consider allowing the rest of these savages to live long enough to make it to the reservation." The offer was clearly a lie, designed more to create dissension among the defenders than to actually negotiate a peaceful resolution. But it also revealed something important about Colt's priorities. Standing Wolf's laugh was harsh as breaking glass. "He's afraid," the young war chief said with satisfaction. If he was confident in his power, he would simply attack without offering terms. But he knows that if we die here, we become martyrs, and martyrs have a way of inspiring others to take up their cause. The war chief began issuing orders in rapid Lakota, sending his warriors to defensive positions that had been prepared for exactly this kind of assault. The siege that followed was unlike anything in Mop's experience of warfare. The territorial forces had the overwhelming advantage in numbers and equipment, but Standing Wolf's warriors knew every secret of the canyon's defenses and had spent months preparing for exactly this kind of attack. Hidden rifle pits commanded the approaches to the valley floor, while carefully placed rock slides could block the main entrances at a moment's notice. Most importantly, the sacred nature of the burial ground meant that the defenders were fighting not just for their own lives, but for the honor of their ancestors. Sarah proved her worth once again during the opening exchanges of gunfire. Her marksmanship skills keeping enemy snipers from gaining advantageous positions on the canyon rim. But it was her tactical suggestions, born from her knowledge of white military doctrine, that allowed Standing Wolf to anticipate and counter several attempts to flank their positions. She had become not just a witness to Indian resistance, but an active participant in it, crossing a line that would make her forever an enemy of her own race in the eyes of territorial authorities. As the siege entered its second day, with ammunition running low and casualties mounting among the defenders, Standing Wolf revealed a plan so audacious that it bordered on madness. The burial ground where they had found Sister Margaret's cache was connected to an extensive network of natural caves that honeycombed the mountain, passages that had been used by his people for generations as escape routes and hiding places. More importantly, these passages emerged at locations that would put a small force behind the besieging army's lines. "We cannot win by defending," Standing Wolf explained as he outlined his strategy on the sand beside their fire. "But we might survive by attacking where they least expect it." A small force moving through the cave system could reach their artillery positions and destroy the cannons that pose the greatest threat to our position. He looked directly at Mop and Sarah. "I can spare 5 warriors for this mission, but it will also require someone who understands white military procedures and someone who can move silently through enemy territory." The mission that followed pushed all of them beyond their previous limits of endurance and courage. The cave system was a maze of narrow passages and vertical shafts that required rope work and climbing, skills that would have challenged experienced mountaineers. Sarah's dress, already torn and stained from their previous ordeals, was reduced to practical rags as she squeezed through openings barely wide enough for a human body. But her determination never wavered. even when they were forced to crawl through passages filled with water, so cold it numbed their limbs. Within minutes, the artillery position they attacked was guarded by overconfident soldiers who had never imagined that Indians could appear behind their carefully established perimeter. The assault was swift and brutal, conducted with the silent efficiency that Mop had learned during his years of warfare against superior forces. But it was Sarah who proved most effective at sabotaging the cannons themselves, her knowledge of mechanical devices allowing her to disable the firing mechanisms in ways that would not be immediately obvious to the artillery crews. The explosion that destroyed the Army's ammunition supply was visible from every corner of the canyon, a pillar of fire and smoke that announced to both sides that the impossible had been accomplished. But the real victory was not the destruction of military equipment, but the psychological impact on the besieging forces. The territorial militia had believed they were facing a cornered and desperate enemy. Now they realized they were fighting an opponent capable of striking at will anywhere within their supposedly secure perimeter. The confusion created by the artillery attack provided the opportunity that Standing Wolf had been waiting for since the siege began. While Colt's forces scrambled to respond to the sabotage and secure their remaining equipment, a handful of the war chief's best riders slipped out of the canyon carrying copies of Sister Margaret's evidence. Their destination was not any territorial authority, but a newspaper editor in Denver whose integrity had been proven through years of exposing corruption and whose circulation reached readers across the entire western frontier. "The truth will survive even if we do not," Standing Wolf told his assembled warriors as they prepared for what they all knew would be the final assault. "Our children will grow up in a world where the lies told about us have been exposed, where the crimes committed against our people have been documented for all to see." The war chief's words carried the weight of prophecy, spoken by a man who had accepted his own mortality in service of a cause greater than personal survival. The last charge of Colt's forces came at dawn on the third day, launched with the desperation of men who knew their window of opportunity was closing. But the defenders were ready, and the battle that followed would be remembered in Lakota oral tradition as one of the great stands against overwhelming odds. Sarah fought beside warriors whose names she would never learn, sharing ammunition and covering retreats with the automatic efficiency of someone who had found her true calling in the crucible of combat. When the shooting finally stopped, the silence that filled the canyon was profound and absolute. Colt lay dead among his men, killed not by an Indian bullet, but by a shot fired from Sarah's rifle as he attempted to execute wounded prisoners. Standing Wolf had fallen defending the sacred burial ground, his body positioned so that his spirit could join those of the ancestors whose rest he had died protecting. Of the 30 warriors who had called this valley home, only a handful survived. But their sacrifice had bought something more valuable than victory. It had bought time for the truth to reach the outside world. Mop found Sarah sitting beside Blue Dawn's body, holding her friend's hand as if she could somehow call her spirit back from whatever journey it had begun. The two women who had brought them together were gone, but the bond forged between a Lakota warrior and an Irish woman had survived everything their enemies could devise to destroy it. They were no longer the people they had been when this journey began. They had become something new, something that belonged neither to the white world nor the Indian world, but to some space between them where love could exist despite the hatred that surrounded it. The riders carrying Sister Margaret's evidence had succeeded in their mission, and within weeks newspaper stories would begin appearing that would eventually bring down the entire Turiel conspiracy. Colt's death had broken the network's leadership, and without his political connections, the surviving conspirators found themselves facing federal investigation by officials who had not been compromised. Justice would come slowly and imperfectly, but it would come, carried forward by the sacrifice of people who had chosen truth over safety and honor over survival. The Wyoming Territory woke to a changed world on the morning after the Battle of Sacred Canyon. In Denver, newspaper presses rolled through the night, printing stories based on the evidence Standing Wolf's riders had died delivering. Headlines screamed accusations reaching from local courthouses to Congress. Territorial governor linked to Indian land conspiracy. Federal marshal exposed as corrupt agent. And most damning, the gold rush built on genocide. Mop and Sarah emerged from the cave system to find a landscape transformed by violence and sacrifice. Among the devastation, something unexpected was taking root. Survivors from both sides, white soldiers and Indian warriors alike, working together to tend wounded and bury dead with dignity that transcended the racial hatred that had brought them here. The Territorial Militia's commanding officer, Lieutenant James Crawford, approached with a white flag and profound confusion. "I don't understand what happened here," he said, voice hoarse from battle. "My men came believing we were hunting criminals, but the evidence your people delivered, it changes everything we thought we knew." Most of his soldiers were farmers who'd been told they were protecting settlers from raiders, not enforcing corrupt politicians' will. Learning the truth had shattered unit morale and created unexpected opening for peace. Within a month, federal investigators arrived with authority superseding all local officials. The investigation, led by prosecutor Eleanor Hartwell, moved with military efficiency and scientific thoroughness. Sarah found herself at the center of congressional hearings, her testimony providing the human face that transformed legal documents into a story capturing national attention. "They ask why I fought alongside warriors defending sacred ground," Sarah told the packed courtroom. "The answer is simple. Sometimes the only way to honor the dead is ensuring their sacrifice has meaning. My father died protecting Indian land rights through legal channels. When those proved corrupt, I continued his fight through the only means available." The findings exceeded worst expectations about territorial corruption. The conspiracy involved an entire network of officials who had systematically violated federal law for personal profit. More than 40 officials were indicted, including territorial judges, U.S. Marshals, and the governor himself. The scandal reached so high it contributed to significant reforms in territorial administration. Mop's role was complex, as his fugitive status had to be balanced against his witness value. Federal prosecutors granted him immunity in exchange for testimony, but required geographic restriction during proceedings. It was house arrest disguised as witness protection, his freedom contingent on continued usefulness. The newspaper stories fundamentally changed how Americans understood Western conflicts. For the first time, readers saw documented evidence of systematic violence and fraud used to justify Indian land seizure. The story of Sarah and Mapa became a symbol transcending specific events, used by editorial writers to argue for everything from women's suffrage to racial equality. Practical consequences were immediate. Land claims based on fraudulent documentation were invalidated, returning thousands of acres to original Indian owners or illegally dispossessed homesteaders. New territorial government was installed with explicit instructions to enforce federal law regardless of local pressures. Most importantly, the investigation established legal precedents influencing federal Indian policy for generations, using congressional reward money for exposing the conspiracy. Map and Sarah purchased a small ranch in a remote valley straddling Wyoming and Montana territories. The location was chosen for isolation from political centers, where notoriety might make them targets, but also for its position between traditional hunting grounds and cattle country. Their ranch became something unprecedented. A place where Indian and white traditions coexisted without either dominating. Mop's land knowledge guided agricultural decisions, while Sarah's understanding of legal systems protected them from fraud. Their success challenged both cultures' assumptions about genuine cooperation across racial lines. The children who joined their family inherited both burden and blessing. They grew up speaking Lakota and English as native languages, understanding warrior traditions and Christian faith equally. But they also knew their existence challenged social conventions many would never accept, their safety depending on the isolation their parents had chosen as love's price. 20 years later, Map and Sarah returned to the twisted cottonwood, where their story began. The tree still stood, branches scarred by rope that nearly claimed Sarah's life, but the crude sign had rotted away. In its place, someone had carved into the bark, "Justice lives here." The surrounding country's transformation reflected broader changes following the conspiracy's exposure. Scattered homesteads were owned by white settlers, Indian families, and mixed couples who had bridged cultural divides. It wasn't harmonious integration idealistic reformers envisioned, but working accommodation allowing different peoples to share land without constant warfare. Sarah's hair was gray now. Map's face bore lines of a man who'd seen too much violence, but their commitment remained strong. They had built something neither original culture could imagine, a family belonging fully to neither world, but creating its own traditions from both. Their ranch had become informal refuge for other mixed families needing a place where children could grow without shame for their heritage. As they stood beneath the old cottonwood witching sunset over land watered with blood and tears, they understood their story was part of something larger than individual love. They had helped prove human compassion could survive the most determined efforts to destroy it, and that justice, however delayed and imperfect, could triumph over forces seeking to divide humanity. The sign proclaiming "Savages don't belong" had been replaced by enduring truth. Love, in all its forms, belongs wherever people have courage to claim it.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.